broken after 2 years. So what failed on my Boundary mountain bike from Walmart? Of course, when I say Boundary, I'm talking about my modified Schwinn Boundary, Project Boundary. In a previous video, I let you know that something had broken. What's the first part to fail? Many of you guessed, and quite a few of you guessed correctly, and a smattering of viewers questioned if it even mattered since it's a project bike. With non-factory parts, you know something is kaput from that previous video, but I didn't tell you what, so let's deduce. Starting with a fade to black, so you can focus. I'll actually probably put something on the screen so it's not blank. The important part, I want you to listen, because I bolted a camera to the frame above where the parts failed, and this audio from the DJI Osmo. Now the same part with different audio. There will be a bit of wind noise here, but still, you should be able to hear it more prominently. So what is that? How about now we do the same audio, but this time with video. Clearly, I'm focusing down at the crankset area, and that's of double importance. Because A, that's where the noise is, and B, for those of you wondering if it mattered, if these were factory parts or not, this particular part of the bike has the factory parts, all but the pedals. Speaking of those factory parts, an important note on that. I've had this bike since February of 2020, that's over 2 years. And those factory parts have been in action all that time, and as I mentioned in my previous video, numerous riders, I've been trying to count, I think up to 9, some of which were over the 250 pound limit for this bike, 260 pounds. And of all the riders that have ridden it, the vast majority of those have done so on a mountain bike trail, and that's both experienced riders and novice riders. First time on a mountain bike or first time on a mountain bike on an actual trail. And if you think that it takes a hardcore mountain biker to test out any bike components, let a complete novice get a hold of a high-dollar full suspension bike and then listen as they shift through 5 gears while standing on the pedals going uphill. All that said, back to the failure point which we know is here. And we can turn this into a teachable moment because if confronted with sounds that are coming from this crankset area, it can really only be one of 3 things. Option 1, the pedals, which can either be a bad bearing or they've come loose, which can happen. In my experience, a pedal issue, be it bearing or loose, is going to be felt more than heard, at least initially. The reason I say you'll feel this before you hear it is because a pedal is one of the 3 main points of contact for a bike. You've got handlebars, you've got pedals, and you've got the seat, the pedals and the handlebars being the primary 2 that you're really going to feel something on. If it gets to the point that there's audio noise to go with the feeling, then you better hope that it's a bearing and not a loose pedal, because if it is a loose pedal, you're already at that point. You have both the feeling and the noise, probably already done damage to the threads here on the crank, which I guess makes that a twofer problem because there would be damage on the threads for the crank and probably on the pedals too. If that's not the case, if it's not the pedals, the next area of possibility would be the crank arm itself, which can come loose. This is a square taper setup. And this is kind of the exact opposite of the pedals. Usually you hear, at least in my experience, I'm basing all this off my experience, a crank arm coming loose will be heard before it's felt. It'll be a creaking noise, and then it'll start popping. If it's a creaking noise, then it can be tightened up here. I don't know, you're not going to be able to see this, but there is actually a torque specification here. There's a little hex bolt, you can tighten that up on this spindle, and this is called the square taper. I'll show you why in just a second. But if it's just creaking, tightening up will usually fix that. If it's to the point that it's making a thunk sound to go with the creaking, or it's actually making a pop feeling you can feel through the pedals, then your crank arm has probably already came loose and wallowed out. Let me show you how this setup works. This is a square taper crank arm. If I get this just right, you'll be able to see that that's a square. And that presses onto the spindle, which is also a square, but you can see is tapered. And that slides in, and this nut torques it down and keeps it in place. You don't want it to get loose, because if it gets loose, this has already started wallowing out, and then that crank arm is shot. One irony here that's better for us big box bike owners than it is for someone from a local bike shop. This square taper setup, it's probably the most common setup that you'll find on bikes, but on big box bikes, ours tend to be almost fused from the factory. They're so difficult to get off that a lot of the times they don't work loose as often as something from a local bike shop. Still though, a byproduct of this design is that it needs to periodically be checked to make sure it's tight, and then there's over tightening, which can mushroom this bolt setup and cause other problems. And that's why there's an actual torque spec here. It's on this plastic washer that this nut goes through that tells how much torque is needed to keep this in place. But in this case, much like the pedals, that's not the issue. And that brings me to the third and final component, and that's the bottom bracket. Remember, this square taper part, there are bearings, there are cups, all this is screwed in and tightened in. There are two things that can go wrong with the bottom bracket. Number one, it can become loose, much like the crank or the pedals can. The bottom bracket can become loose, but also it can just wear out. And on these big box bottom brackets, the bearings, let me see if I can find a bearing. Well, look at this, we're in luck. This is the bottom bracket as it sits right behind this. You can see there's a cup, there's a cage bearing, and you can see not a lot of lubrication. From the factory, a lot of times these aren't lubed all that well. And that's on, but well, there's a bearing on the second side as well. But it's just not here, it must have fallen out. It's probably on the floor, and you can see a little seal there. That is the square taper setup, and those bearings can either wear out from not being properly lubricated, a little drop, not being properly torqued. I'm laughing at myself because I always drop tools and parts, always. But these can either wear out, the bearings can wear out, they cannot be tightened properly, which can cause them to wear out. And you can see that seal, it's just a little rubber seal, and this bike in particular, I know this bike has been outside, it's been ridden when it's raining, so a little water can get in there, and even if there's some lubrication from the factory, that can slowly wear out the lubrication, which it hastens this wearing out. So that's what our problem is here. And how do I know that it's the bottom bracket? Well, of course, I've checked the other two things, so that only leaves one thing. And on top of that, I know that when I'm putting pressure on the pedals and I'm getting that clunk, I need to start looking at the bottom bracket if I've ruled out the other two things. And also, there's this. Let me get the chain out of the way here. I don't know how well you can hear this. Hear how rough that sounds? I can hear the bearing in there. That's not a good sound. Plus, this is very, when I'm moving this down, I can feel, you can almost see it popping between the points. Oh, and there was a skipped one there. So one of those bearings might be completely toast, but this is just gritty and rough. So that tells me that it's the bottom bracket. I'm going to give you a bonus. I'm going to go ahead and take this apart on camera. And by the way, that's the part I talked about would mushroom. If you torque this down too much, and let's see if I can show you here. 28 to 31 foot-pounds is the torque rating there. So pretty tight. And you need a special tool to get the crank off. And there we go. I spared you all the swearing. But like most bike jobs, this takes a special, mini bike jobs, this takes a specialty tool. I'll put a link to this down in the description. But I've got my crank off. There's the bottom bracket. Works wonders and much easier for me than the big nut setup that you use a larger wrench with. I just hammer on it. It's so far held up. It's starting to wear a little bit there, but God, there's no telling how many times I've used this. It was righty-loosey. This time it's going to be lefty-loosey. And now, moment of truth time. Oh yeah. See if you can see. Can you see that bearing? See, the cage is collapsing there on the top. So I was actually wrong. I would have bet that it was the bearing on the right side. But it looks like it's the one here on the, yeah, there it is. It's two of them. It's the bearing here on the left side. So, ooh, look at that. Oh, and look at that. Metal shavings. So, there we go. And also, I don't know if you can see the dirt, just the muck up in that cup. There's more metal shavings. I've got little tiny metal shavings all over my hand, so that's probably the second bearing. Get this off. We'll take a look at this other side bearing. Yeah, start out with gloves. Never fails. I always forget and then just grab on with my hand. But let's get this out. This one also, yeah. Can you see the cage right there? It's actually teardrop shaped. You see that? I don't know how well this is coming out on camera, but that has came to a point right there on the inside. Right here on the inside, this come to, oh, and I can feel. I could actually cut myself. Yeah, see? See that? So both of these cage bearings have been damaged. And that's where the clunk is coming from. So there, bottom bracket pulled out. Oh, look at that. BB for bottom bracket. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and convert this to IXF like I do on many of my bikes, and then it will be in full project status. So there we go. If you guessed that it was bottom bracket, you would have been correct. That was what the clunk is. So remember, always check, first starting with the pedals, then the crank arms, and then the bottom bracket if you don't already know, but I knew from the second that I heard and felt the clunk exactly what this was. Like I said, I'll get this converted over and then we'll get this back on the trail with gosh knows how many more riders. Then I'll let you know if something else happens with it. Thanks for watching KevCentral. Be sure to comment below if you've missed seeing Project Boundary. I've had it loaned out for so long. But again, thanks for watching KevCentral. Have a great day.